34th anniversary of the kidnapping killing of UT Austin student Mark Kilroy in Matamoros, Mexico.
And it's understandable why Ryan Fenley hasn't moved on from his friend's murder.
By the time the sun rose over South Padre Island on the morning of March 14, 1989, Mark should have been asleep in his hotel room, sunburned, exhausted, and laughing to himself about the night before. He wasn't. Somewhere across the border, in a city he had crossed into for nothing more than cheap drinks and the company of his oldest friends, an ordinary night had quietly folded into something else. His three best friends didn't know it yet. His parents, 200 miles north, were sleeping soundly. And Mark, 21 years old, with his whole future arranged so neatly in front of him, had no idea that he had just spent the last ordinary hours he would ever be given. His name was Mark James Kilroy. He was born on March 5, 1968 in Chicago, Illinois. But Chicago was never really his story. While he was still young, his family moved south, settling in Santa Fe, Texas, a small, church-going community about 30 miles down the highway from Houston, the kind of town where people knew each other's children by name and front doors stayed unlocked. It was the sort of place that produced exactly the sort of young man Mark turned out to be. To understand Mark, you have to understand the house he grew up in. His mother and father, Helen and Jim, were devout Catholics, and their faith was not the quiet, once-a-week kind. They helped run things at their church. They threw themselves into local charity work, and the family took in foster children, opening their home to kids who needed somewhere safe to land. Service to other people wasn't presented to Mark as a virtue to aspire to someday. In the Kilroy household, it was simply the way life was lived, as routine as dinner on the table. That quiet decency soaked into him early, and the people who knew him would spend the rest of their lives describing it. Because by every account, Mark was the genuine article, the kid other parents wished their own would befriend. At Santa Fe High School, he was an honor student, the type who made the work look easier than it was. He was a Boy Scout. He sat on the student council, and he was an athlete through and through, lacing up for basketball, baseball, and golf, throwing himself into each season with the easy energy of someone who simply liked being part of a team. It was on those teams that he found the people who mattered most to him: Bill, Bradley, and Brent, teammates who became something closer to brothers. They were the friends he laughed loudest with, the ones who knew the version of Mark that didn't show up on a report card. And that version was worth knowing. Friends remembered him as warm and unfailingly loyal, the friend who would, as one of them later put it, give you the shirt off his back without a second thought. He was bright and athletic and serious about where his life was headed, but he wasn't a cardboard cutout of a good kid. He was funny. He was easygoing. He was the friendly one, the one who struck up conversations with strangers and somehow made them feel like they'd known him for years. People were simply drawn to him, and that openness, that instinct to talk to whoever crossed his path, was one of the most alive things about him. He graduated from Santa Fe High in 1986 and carried all of it, the brains, the discipline, the warmth, to the University of Texas at Austin. There, Mark set his sights on something genuinely difficult: medicine. By the spring of 1989, he was a junior, deep in the grind of pre-med coursework, the brutal stretch of biology and chemistry and late nights that weeds out everyone who isn't cert. Mark was cert. Medical school sat on the horizon like a fixed point, and he was steadily walking toward it. His professors saw it. His friends saw it. The boy who had grown up watching his parents care for foster children and strangers in need wanted to spend his life caring for people too. It fit him perfectly. But even the most driven 21-year-old needs to come up for air, and by early March of 1989, Mark had earned it. The pre-med workload had been relentless that semester, and spring break was finally close enough to taste. So he and his friends did what thousands of Texas college students did every March. They made a plan to chase the sun. The destination was South Padre Island, that long ribbon of beach at the southern tip of Texas, where, for 1 week a year, the whole world seemed to be 21 and free. The group was Mark and his three closest friends, Bradley, Bill, and Brent. There was supposed to be a fifth. Another friend, Ryan, had planned to ride down with them, but roughly 48 hours before they left, he backed out, pulled away by a separate invitation, a chance to go skiing instead. It was the kind of last-minute change nobody thinks twice about in the moment, a coin flip decision made over a phone call. Ryan would think about that decision for the rest of his life. When the plans firmed up, Bradley finished his exams early and drove to Austin to scoop Mark up, and the group pointed the car south toward the Gulf. South Padre in March of 1989 delivered everything four young men could have hoped for: open beaches, enormous crowds, music spilling out of every doorway, and the particular, weightless freedom of being 21 with your exams behind you and a week of nothing ahead. They were exactly where they wanted to be, surrounded by people exactly like them. And just across the water from Brownsville, a short walk over the International Bridge, sat the Mexican border city of Matamoros, its own gravity pulling at every American student on the island. Over there, the bars were louder, the discos went later, and a cold beer cost about $1. Alcohol was easier to find and far cheaper on the Mexican side. And so American kids streamed across by the thousands that week, laughing their way over the bridge in groups, certain that the worst thing that could happen to them was a hangover. Mark crossed too. He went with his friends the way he did everything together, easy, unafraid. There was a first night out that ended around 2:30 in the morning, the four of them walking back over the bridge to the American side, swapping stories, a good night behind them. It was harmless. It was fun. It was exactly what spring break was supposed to be. So the next night, they decided to go back. To understand how a 21-year-old pre-med student vanished 200 feet from the American border, you have to leave the beaches of Texas behind and travel back nearly 3 decades to a hospital in Miami, Florida. There, on November 1st, 1962, a boy was born to a Cuban immigrant girl who was barely a child herself, only 15 years old. His name was Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, and from the very beginning, the world he was born into was strange, unstable, and steeped in things most children never encounter. His mother, Delia, would go on to have 3 children, each by a different father, and she did not stay in one place for long. When her first husband died, she moved the family to San Juan, Puerto Rico, and married again. The young Adolfo was, on the surface, raised in the rituals of ordinary Catholic life, baptized in the faith, dressed as an altar boy, serving at the front of the church. But there was another current running underneath all of it. His mother was a believer in older, darker traditions, and she carried her son along on those journeys too, reportedly taking him on trips to learn the practices of Afro-Caribbean folk religion. From his earliest years, Adolfo lived with one foot in the candle-lit calm of the Catholic Mass and the other in something far less gentle. The family returned to Miami in 1972, and almost immediately, instability struck again. His stepfather died not long after the move, leaving the household with a small inheritance. His mother soon remarried, and her new husband, according to accounts of the period, was a man entangled in both the occult and the local drug trade, a combination that would later read like a blueprint for the life Adolfo built. Around their neighborhood in Little Havana, neighbors had begun to whisper about the household. Some said his mother was a witch. People who crossed her, the stories went, would reportedly find the carcasses of headless animals left on their doorsteps. This was the atmosphere a boy was breathing as he grew up, fear used as a tool, faith twisted into a weapon, the supernatural treated as a thing you could point at your enemies. As a teenager, Adolfo stopped being merely a witness to all of this and started becoming a student of it. He reportedly apprenticed himself to a local practitioner of Palo Mayam, an Afro-Cuban religion with roots in the Congo, built around the veneration of ancestral spirits, and in its ceremonies, the use of bones and blood in a sacred iron cauldron called a nganga. It's worth being precise here, because the case is so often misunderstood. In its authentic form, Palo Mayam does not sanction human sacrifice. What Constanzo would eventually create was a grotesque private distortion of it. But the framework, the cauldron, the offerings, the belief that ritual could buy power and protection, was learned early. He also, by some accounts, fell in with a Haitian figure in Miami who taught him not only more about ritual, but how to deal drugs and how to con people out of their money. Those two skills, faith and fraud, would become the twin engines of everything that followed. It's important to say plainly what the record does and does not contain. There is no publicly documented psychiatric diagnosis for Constanzo, no court-ordered evaluation that survives in the public account, because he never lived to stand trial. So this is not a story of a man whose mental illness was identified and ignored. What the record shows instead is behavior, a steadily escalating appetite for control, a willingness to use terror as currency, and a charisma so effective that grown, dangerous men handed him their loyalty and their lives. Whatever was wrong inside him, it expressed itself not as chaos, but as command. In 1983, Constanzo reportedly committed himself fully to the darkest figure in his version of the faith. The following year, in 1984, he moved to Mexico City and set about building an empire. He was, by every description made for it, fair-skinned, handsome, magnetic, a man who had reportedly even worked as a model. In the capital, he offered tarot readings, spiritual cleansings, fortune-telling, and protective rituals, and he charged for them. His clientele climbed fast and high. He is said to have served wealthy socialites, entertainers, politicians, and most fatefully, drug traffickers and corrupt police officials. For substantial sums, reportedly several $1,000s per ceremony, Constanzo would promise his clients that his rituals could keep them safe during their criminal work. He sold supernatural insurance to men who lived and died by luck, and they bought it eagerly. He did not work alone for long. He drew followers into his orbit and bound them to him, recruiting devoted lieutenants, some of whom became his lovers, all of whom came to call him El Padrino, the Godfather. Later, he would elevate a young woman named Sarah Aldrete to a position of authority within the group. His followers called her La Madrina, the Godmother. To outsiders, they could pass as a charismatic spiritual leader and his striking, college-educated companion. Inside, they presided over something monstrous. By the late 1980s, the rituals had crossed every line. Constanzo's drug connections eventually led him to a marijuana smuggling operation running through a ranch near Matamoros, on the Texas border. The family that ran it had been thrown into disarray after its leader was killed, and Constanzo did what he always did. He stepped into the vacuum. Using the same charisma that had seduced Mexico City's elite, he reportedly convinced the men of that operation that his rituals could make them invisible to police and even impervious to bullets. They believed him. They believed him enough to take part in his ceremonies, and by 1988, he had effectively moved in and taken the ranch as his own. What happened there is the reason this case is remembered with such horror. Investigators would ultimately tie the cult to at least 15 killings, with some estimates running higher. The victims were tortured and ritually slain, most of them connected in some way to the drug world, rivals, debtors, the unlucky. For nearly 3 years, the bodies fed Constanzo's twisted machine, and the men around him grew only more convinced of his power. And then, in March of 1989, Constanzo reportedly decided he needed something he had never taken before. Not a rival, not a drug world enemy. He wanted, by the accounts of those later arrested, the sacrifice of an Anglo-American, a bright young student, believing it would render his entire operation untouchable by the law. 200 miles to the north, 4 friends were packing a car for the beach. The night of March 13th began like the one before it, easy, loud, and harmless. Mark and his 3 friends, Bradley, Bill, and Brent, decided to head back across the border for one more night in Matamoros. This time they were smart about the car, leaving it parked on the American side and crossing the international bridge on foot, the way thousands of students were doing all around them. They started at a bar called El Sombrero for a couple of drinks, then drifted a few blocks down to a place that had just been rechristened the Hard Rock, a name borrowed to pull in the American crowd. It worked. The night unfolded exactly as a spring break night was supposed to. At some point, Mark peeled off from his friends for a few minutes to find a young woman he'd met earlier in the week, a girl who had, by the accounts of the trip, placed third in a beach tanning contest. He found her, said his good night, and came back to the group. There was nothing ominous about any of it. It was the small, ordinary social geometry of being 21. Around 2 in the morning, the four of them pointed themselves back toward the bridge, trading stories from the day, in good spirits, only about 200 feet from the American border. 200 feet, the length of a city block, that close. It was there in those last few steps that the night fractured. Bill stepped away from the group to relieve himself behind a tree in a small park. As he did, he noticed a Mexican man on the street making gestures toward the group, and he heard Mark call out something in return, something that sounded like a greeting, a half-recognition, words to the effect of "Didn't I just see you somewhere?" To Bill, it read as nothing. Mark was forever the friendly one, the one who talked to everybody, so Bill assumed he must know the man and thought no more of it. He finished and walked back to where Brad and Brent were standing. Mark wasn't with them. The friends did what anyone would do. They glanced around. They waited, certain he'd reappear out of the crowd any second. They backtracked along the route. They walked all the way to the car, thinking maybe he'd gone ahead. He hadn't. They waited longer and finally landed on the only explanation that made sense to four young men in the middle of spring break. Mark must have caught a ride back to the hotel with someone else. People split off all the time on nights like this. It was, in the moment, an entirely reasonable thing to believe, so they drove back across the border without him. But according to a friend who later recounted what investigators pieced together, the truth had taken only minutes. In the brief window while Bill stepped away, a vehicle had reportedly pulled up, and Mark, friendly, unsuspecting, 200 feet from home, was forced inside and driven off into the dark. The whole thing, reportedly, took 3 or 4 minutes at most. The most dangerous thing about Mark Kilroy that night was the very thing everyone had always loved about him. He would talk to anyone. What happened next is reconstructed from the statements of those later arrested, and it should be told plainly but without cruelty, because Mark deserves that. He was taken roughly 20 miles west of Matamoros to a remote property called Rancho Santa Elena and placed inside a shack. By the suspect's own accounts, he was bound and gagged with heavy electrician's tape. He was told that nothing would happen to him, a lie, meant to keep him calm. He was given a simple meal of eggs, bread, and water, and then he was held alone in that shed for roughly 12 hours. It is almost unbearable to think about. A young man who wanted to spend his life healing people, kept overnight in the heat by men who believed his death would make them untouchable. Hours later, he was led outside, and the cult's leader, Constanzo, ended his life. The remains, investigators would find, had been used in the group's ritual. When one of the men was later asked why the body had been further mutilated, he reportedly gave an answer chilling in its flatness, that it had nothing to do with any ritual. It had simply made the body easier to bury. But Mark's family and friends knew none of this. To them, the morning of March 14th began with a far more ordinary kind of dread. He hadn't come back, he wasn't at the hotel, and the easy explanation from the night before curdled into something cold. They reported him missing. At first, even the authorities weren't alarmed. Students vanished in Matamoros during spring break with grim regularity, and almost all of them surfaced within a day, hungover, embarrassed, unable to account for the night before. So the search for Mark Kilroy began as a routine missing person case. The kind that usually resolves itself by sundown, except this one didn't. One day passed, then another. Mark did not reappear, and the routine curdled into something far darker as officials on both sides of the border began to suspect foul play. What turned this case from a statistic into an international story was, in part, the people who loved Mark refusing to let it become one. His parents, Jim and Helen, flew to Brownsville and took the search into their own hands. They printed and handed out tens of thousands of leaflets across the Rio Grande Valley. They offered a reward for any information about their son, and a local businessman, moved by their anguish, reportedly raised it further. Mark had an uncle who worked for U.S. Customs, and through that connection, a task force took shape on the American side. The U.S. consulate was pulled in. Mark's description went out to jails and hospitals. Investigators grew so desperate for a lead that they brought in a hypnotist, and under hypnosis, one of his friends recalled having last seen Mark talking to a young man with a cut on his face, a fragment, but something. Then the case went national. On a Sunday in late March, Mark's disappearance was featured on America's Most Wanted. The broadcast generated thousands of phone calls and letters from across the country. And yet, for all of it, the leaflets, the reward, the task force, the national television audience, not one usable lead emerged. The trail was stone cold. Eventually, heartbroken and empty-handed, Jim and Helen returned home to Santa Fe without their son, the yellow ribbon still tied around the town, vowing to come back. 3 weeks went by, then a fourth, and then the break in the Mark Kilroy case came from the last place anyone was looking, not from the search at all, but from a careless young man and a routine police checkpoint on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The thing that finally cracked the Mark Kilroy case open had nothing to do with the leaflets, the reward, or the national television broadcast. It came, instead, from a single act of stunning carelessness on the afternoon of Sunday, April 9th, 1989. A young man named Serfiq10 Garciqt drove straight through a federal police checkpoint outside Matamoros without slowing down. He was the nephew of a well-known local figure named Elio Harnaqtendz Rivra, whose family ran a marijuana smuggling operation in the area. And by the cult's own warped logic, Serfiq10 may have believed he simply could not be touched, that Constanzo rituals had rendered him invisible to the law. He was about to learn how wrong that belief was. Federal officers were not impressed by his confidence. They followed him, and he led them almost casually back to his family's property, Rancho Santa Elena, roughly 20 miles west of Matamoros. The police raided it. In the search, they turned up dozens of pounds of marijuana and a cache of weapons, more than enough to justify the bust on its own. But then the lead investigator's attention snagged on something else entirely, a small, rundown shack on the property. Inside, the floor was littered with melted candles, cigar butts, and empty bottles. Outside stood iron cauldrons. The investigator had seen enough in the region to recognize what he was looking at. This was a ritual site, and the implications turned his stomach. What happened next reveals how strange this case truly was. The Mexican commander halted the drug search entirely and summoned a curandero, a traditional spiritual healer, to purify the site before his men would continue. The American officers present were reportedly frustrated to the point of disbelief. They didn't believe in any of it and wanted to push forward. But to the Mexican commander, this was not negotiable. Only once the site had been cleansed did the work resume. And once it did, everything moved fast. Members and associates of the Harnaqtendz operation were arrested, though several key figures, including Constanzo himself and his second-in-command, Sara-Aldrete, had already slipped away. Among those taken into custody was a ranch caretaker. At first, he was paralyzed by fear of his bosses and said nothing. But once he understood that those men were going to be locked away for a very long time, he began to talk. Investigators showed him a photograph of Mark Kilroy. He recognized him immediately and reportedly told them he had seen the young man handcuffed in the back of a car, right there in the yard of the ranch. In the interrogation rooms, the story came apart completely. Elio Harnaqtendz Rivra SCRAFIQ-10 and others confessed to abducting Mark and to witnessing his ritual killing. SCRAFIQ-10 admitted that he himself had buried the body, and that same day, he led the authorities to the grave. It was marked, eerily, by a piece of wire poking up out of the ground. The reason was its own small horror. The wire had reportedly been attached to the victim's spine, so that after the body decomposed, the bones could be retrieved. Under the afternoon sun, at gunpoint, SCRAFIQ-10 was made to dig, and as the digging went on, it became clear that Mark was not alone down there. By mid-afternoon, the remains of around a dozen people had been laid out in a row. On April 11, 1989, officials confirmed the worst. Mark Kilroy was among them. BROWNSVILLE police identified him through dental comparison. This is the moment to acknowledge the others because they matter too. Mark's name is the one the world remembers, but he was not the only person whose life ended at that ranch. The victims recovered there were, apart from Mark, all Mexican, and they included a policeman, a police volunteer, and a 16-year-old boy. They had families who searched and grieved just as the Kilroys did, even if the cameras never found them. Any honest telling of this case has to hold them in the frame. There was still one name unaccounted for, the man who had ordered it all. Warrants went out for CONSTANZO and his closest allies, but he was already gone, having reportedly flown out of Texas to an apartment in Mexico City. Investigators, working with an expert in the religion CONSTANZO had twisted, made a calculated move. On April 22nd, they burned the ritual shack at the ranch to the ground and destroyed the great iron cauldron at the center of his ceremonies. The reasoning was almost psychological warfare. They had been told that CONSTANZO would be unhinged by the loss of his cauldron, that it might draw him into the open. By accounts of those around him, he did indeed spiral, growing paranoid, sleepless, and increasingly volatile as he watched the news close in. The end, when it came on May 6, 1989, arrived by yet another coincidence. Police were canvassing a Mexico City neighborhood, going door to door in search of a missing child, an errand that had nothing whatsoever to do with CONSTANZO. But in the building where he was hiding, his own behavior betrayed him. Cornered by his paranoia, he had reportedly begun burning cash and flinging money out of the window to the street below, and residents had noticed. The officer's attention turned toward his apartment. When CONSTANZO saw them approaching, he concluded he was finished and opened fire with an Uzi. A gunfight erupted that reportedly stretched past 40 minutes, wounding an officer. By the accounts that emerged afterward, CONSTANZO did not wait for the police to take him. He reportedly ordered one of his own followers to shoot him so he would never be captured alive. When the gunfire finally stopped, the godfather of MATAMOROS was dead, and the surviving members of his cult were taken into custody. Because CONSTANZO died that day, he never faced a courtroom. The justice that remained fell to his followers, and it took years. The main prosecution tied to Mark Kilroy and Rancho Santa Elena concluded in Mexico in early May of 1994, more than 5 years after Mark's death. The principal perpetrators, including ELIO HERNAQ10DZ RIVRA, SERAFIQ10 HERNAQ10DZ GARCIQT, and others identified as central to the killings, each received sentences of 67 years. Others closely tied to the group received terms as long as 62 years. SARAALDRETE, the so-called godmother, was among those sentenced to 62. SERAFIQ10 tried to recant, alleging that his confession had been beaten out of him at gunpoint. The court rejected the claim. After all, he had known precisely what had happened to the dead and exactly where to find them. The conviction stood, built on the bodies, the burial site, the drugs and weapons, the ritual objects, the witness who placed Mark at the ranch, and the confessions of the men who had been there. For the Kilroys, no verdict could undo a single moment of it. But they had already decided that Mark's death would not be the end of his story. When a young person is taken the way Mark Kilroy was taken, There is a temptation to let the horror have the last word, to let the cauldron and the ranch and the machete define everything. But that is not how Mark's story actually ends, because the two people who loved him most refused to let it. Jim and Helen Kilroy did something almost impossible to comprehend. By the account that followed them for the rest of their lives, they forgave the men who murdered their son quickly and out of the Catholic faith that had shaped their whole family. That faith did not make the grief smaller. What it did was give them somewhere to put it. Within months of Mark's death in 1989, Jim and Helen founded the Mark Kilroy Foundation, and they poured the rest of their lives into it. The foundation became a vehicle for everything the family believed in: a tryst youth intervention counseling placed in school districts, summer programs that filled kids' empty hours with archery and fishing and golf, anti-drug scholarships, and years of fundraising dinners. The idea was almost stubbornly simple: keep young people occupied, supported, and steered away from the drug world that had swallowed their son. Jim told their story in full in a book called Sacrifice, co-written with Bob Stewart, and the proceeds went straight back into the cause. The grieving parents also became reluctant safety advocates, urging students heading off to spring break to stay together and look out for one another, the exact thing that might have changed everything in those 200 feet near the bridge. They took that mission all the way to Washington. The Kilroys met with officials at the highest level, including President George H.W. Bush and the administration's drug policy leadership, pressing the case that the violence which had killed Mark was not somebody else's distant problem. For a country in the grip of the late 1980's war on drugs, Mark Kilroy became a face, a clean-cut honor student from a church-going Texas family that made the stakes impossible to look away from. Time, of course, kept moving, and it was not gentle. Helen Kilroy died in 2014 after a battle with ALS, having spent 25 years carrying her son's memory forward. Jim continued as the foundation's president and chairman for the rest of his life. He died on September 18, 2024, at the age of 80. By the accounts of those who knew them, the couple's defining quality to the very end was not their tragedy but their generosity, a boundless ability to forgive. As one person who knew them through the foundation put it, they had taken the worst thing that can happen to a parent and answered it for 35 years with service. Mark's brother, Keith, survives them, and the foundation Jim and Helen built still bears Mark's name. And what of the people responsible? The man at the center of it, Constanzo, escaped every courtroom by dying in that Mexico City shootout in May of 1989, never tried, never sentenced, dead by his own arrangement at 26. His followers did not get that exit. The principal members of the cult, including Elio Hernandez Rivera and Serafin Hernandez Garcia, received prison terms of more than 60 years each. Sarah Aldry, the woman his followers called the Godmother, was convicted and given a decades-long sentence, and she remains incarcerated in Mexico. In the years since, she has consistently maintained her innocence, casting herself as a young woman manipulated and frightened into Constanzo's orbit rather than a willing architect of the killings. And she has, reportedly, petitioned for early release after more than 3 decades behind bars. Notably, American authorities have reportedly signaled that if Aldrete is ever freed in Mexico, they intend to pursue charges against her in the United States for Mark's murder. The case, in that sense, is still not fully closed. So what does all of this leave us with more than 3 decades on? A few hard truths, none of them comfortable. The first is how thin the membrane really was between an ordinary night and an unthinkable one. Mark did nothing reckless. He was sober enough to walk home, surrounded by friends, 200 feet from the safety of his own country, doing the most universal thing a friendly young man can do, saying a word to a stranger. The randomness of it is the part that still chills people, because it strips away the false comfort we reach for when we hear about a killing. The sense that the victim must have done something, taken some risk we ourselves would never take. Mark hadn't. That could have been anyone's son. The second truth is about belief, and how dangerous it becomes when it is harnessed by the right kind of predator. Constanzo did not overpower a gang of hardened criminals with force. He did it with conviction, selling frightened, superstitious men the fantasy that ritual could make them bulletproof and invisible to the law. The men who dug the graves and held the victims genuinely believed they were buying protection. The case became a centerpiece of the so-called satanic panic of that era. But the real horror underneath the occult trappings was something far more ordinary and far more human. The way a charismatic manipulator can convince otherwise functioning people to do monstrous things, one rationalization at a time. The third truth is the quietest one, and it belongs to the names that history almost forgot. Mark Kilroy is remembered because he was young, American, and photogenic, and because his family fought to keep the cameras on him. But the others pulled from that ranch, the police volunteer, the teenage boy, the men whose families never got a national broadcast, were no less stolen, no less mourned in the homes they left behind. A complete reckoning with this case has to make room for all of them. In the end, though, this is Mark's story, and he deserves to be remembered as more than the way he died. He was a son in a house full of faith and foster children. He was the friend who would give you the shirt off his back, the honor student who wanted to be a doctor, the boy who talked to everyone because he liked people. He was 21 years old, with the whole long arc of a healing, useful life still ahead of him, a life that would have touched countless others had he ever gotten the chance to live it. His parents spent the rest of their days making sure that some of that good still happened anyway, in his name. Your name was Mark Kilroy. You were kind and bright and so close to home. You should have had decades, a medical degree, patients you'd never know you saved, a family of your own, an ordinary old age. The world is dimmer for the years it never got to spend with you. And all these decades later, you are still missed and still loved and still finally remembered as the person you were, and not only for the night you were taken.